The knock came at 7:03 a.m. Not a casual knock, either. The kind that carries entitlement in every rap. I had just sat down with a cup of coffee, enjoying that rare piece of a morning where the kids were still asleep and the dog hadn't yet decided to bark at the wind. Then came the knock again, louder. I opened the door, and there she stood, Karen. Her name isn't really Karen, of course. It's probably something like Linda or Brenda. But the way she stood there with her HOA clipboard, righteous fury glowing like a halo, she was every inch a Karen. She didn't say good morning. She held out two papers like they were eviction notices from the heavens. You are in violation of Section 8B of the HOA agreement. This is your formal notice and first fine. $500. I took the paper and looked at it, still half asleep. Violation: unauthorized vehicle parking. Offense: commercial vehicle in a residential zone. My eyes traveled from the form back to her smug face. You're finding me for parking my truck in my own driveway? I asked. It's not just a truck, she sniffed. It's clearly a work vehicle. It's disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic. Now, let me be clear. This isn't a rust bucket or a monster truck with flames on the side. It's a well-maintained silver Ford F-150. No decals, no ladder strapped to the roof, just a clean, everyday truck that's never even leaked a drop of oil on the driveway. Karen wasn't hearing any of it. It's commercial. You can appeal the fine at the monthly HOA board meeting, but I wouldn't get your hopes up. With that, she pivoted on her orthopedic sandals and strutted away like she just delivered a divine judgment. I stood there, holding the fine, trying to decide if I was still dreaming. I wasn't. This was real. Karen had declared war, and her first shot had landed right in my wallet. That's the thing about Karen. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-declared queen of the cul-de-sac. She didn't just enforce the rules. She created them, interpreted them, and enforced them with an iron fist disguised as a floral gardening glove. She once fined a neighbor $75 because the Halloween decorations included a politically insensitive skeleton. Another got a citation for an unapproved lawn gnome color scheme. No one was safe. People whispered about fighting back, but no one ever did. The HOA board, a bunch of yes-men too scared to challenge her, were affectionately known as the Stepford Board. I went back inside and placed the fine on the counter. My wife raised an eyebrow when she saw it. "Let me guess," she said. "Karen?" I nodded, and she rolled her eyes. "You going to the board meeting?" "No," I said, smiling slowly. "I've got a better idea." See, what Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that 2 months ago, I'd been elected mayor of our small town. It was a quiet race, mostly unnoticed by residents outside the city limits. I hadn't brought it up to the neighbors because, frankly, I liked the idea of living like a normal guy. No politics, no flashing the badge, just mowing the lawn and coaching my kids' soccer team. But now, Karen had poked the bear, and this bear had a town hall behind him. Still, I wasn't going to throw my title around just yet. That's not how this would play out. Karen needed to fall, but she needed to fall from her own perch, blind to what was coming. I had to keep living like I wasn't the mayor. I still mowed my lawn every Thursday, still waved to neighbors, still walked the dog with a coffee in one hand and a poop bag in the other. But in the background, I began to dig. Karen's HOA reign had lasted 5 years. In that time, she'd rewritten the bylaws to give herself extended terms, shifted voting procedures to favor her cronies, and built a culture of fear and compliance. But I knew if you pulled at the right threads, the whole thing would unravel. I started by reviewing the HOA's public records, budgets, votes, amendments. I found some strange things. Annual budgets that didn't balance, landscaping expenses that were 5 times higher than what the actual landscaper charged, duplicate charges for things like sprinkler repairs. It was sloppy, arrogant fraud. But the real jackpot came when I found the election logs, or rather, the lack of them. Karen hadn't held a legitimate HOA board election in over 3 years. She just reappointed people under a clause that no challenges came forward, except that clause wasn't valid under the HOA's original articles filed with the county. She'd rewritten that too, without a proper vote. I could have reported her then and there, but it wasn't time yet. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down. Not only did she send me a second notice, this time with a $50 processing fee, but she also left a passive-aggressive flyer in my mailbox titled Community Image Matters. It featured a clip-out picture of a smiling family standing in front of a sedan, not a truck. That week, she also banned basketball hoops visible from the street and posted a new sign that read, "Vehicles must be sedans or SUVs, no exceptions." Neighbors started grumbling louder. Some even came to me to vent, not knowing I was already working behind the scenes. One guy, Tim from 3 doors down, said he was fined for having his garage open for more than 10 minutes. Another, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lanning, got a warning for letting her granddaughter draw on the driveway with chalk. The colors were too loud, Karen had said. It distracts drivers. I listened, I nodded, I took notes, and I kept my title hidden because when this all came crashing down, I didn't want to be the guy who flexed authority. I wanted to be the guy who let the truth do the talking. By the end of the week, the whole neighborhood was simmering, but Karen was blissfully unaware. She strutted past houses with her measuring tape and clipboard like a middle-aged stormtrooper. My truck still sat in the driveway, clean, polished, and parked with pride. Every morning, I drank my coffee on the porch and waved at her. She pretended not to see me, but she did. And as she scribbled her 3rd violation into her little book, I leaned back and smiled. The pieces were falling into place. The queen of the HOA was about to learn that not all pawns are powerless. Some of them are kings, some of them are mayors, and some of them are very, very patient. This war had just begun. 2 months ago, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I had stood in a town hall surrounded by a handful of voters and been sworn in as the mayor of our sleepy little town. There was no parade, no confetti, just a simple handshake, a framed certificate, and a surprising sense of responsibility. I didn't run for the title to wield power. In fact, I had hoped to leave all of that behind once I got home every evening. My street, my neighborhood, was supposed to be my refuge. The last place I expected to face a political battlefield was my own front lawn. But Karen had changed that. She didn't know, of course, and that was my advantage. While she terrorized the neighborhood with her clipboard and passive-aggressive bulletins, I smiled, waved, and let her believe I was just another helpless resident under her reign. It was almost funny. She strutted around like a queen, handing out fines like royal decrees while I sat quietly with the power to dismantle her entire kingdom. But I wasn't going to bulldoze her with titles and authority. That would be too easy, too expected. No. I wanted to tear it all down piece by piece and let her watch every brick fall. I began quietly pulling city records late at night in my home office while the kids slept. My desk looked like something out of a detective drama. Folders stacked high, pages spread across the surface, highlighted marks connecting names and numbers. The HOA's official filings, financial records, amendment notes, all of it painted a picture of a dictatorship disguised as community management. There were major inconsistencies in the way rules were enforced, suspicious budget line items, and changes to election policies that had never gone through a proper voting process. Karen hadn't just been power-hungry, she had been sloppy. One document in particular caught my attention. It was a copy of the HOA's original charter filed with the city. It clearly outlined the requirements for electing board members, nomination periods, community votes, and term limits. The last official election? 5 years ago. Since then, Karen had simply renewed her presidency every term, claiming no one else applied. But that process wasn't even legal under the original charter. She had fabricated the current rules entirely and enforced them like gospel. I found scanned copies of newsletters she'd written that conveniently omitted key election dates, ensuring no one could challenge her. That's when I knew I had her. I wasn't just going to challenge the fine. I was going to challenge the entire system she had built. But first, I needed more than just documents. I needed stories. I needed testimony. So I began speaking with neighbors, not as a mayor, but as a fellow victim of Karen's tyranny. I played dumb. I nodded as they ranted, asked questions like I didn't already know the answers, and what I heard only added fuel to the fire. Tim, who lived a few doors down, told me he'd once been fined for having a garden hose coiled the wrong way. Apparently, the direction of the coil created visual disharmony. Another neighbor, Grace, said she'd been warned not to leave her garbage bins out more than 8 minutes after the truck passed. 8 minutes! I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Karen had actually timed her. Then there was Mrs. Lanning, the sweet older lady whose granddaughter's chalk drawings had apparently violated property appearance standards. She said she cried after receiving the warning letter. Not because of the fine, but because she felt humiliated. It had been years since she'd felt welcome in her own community. That stuck with me. These weren't just petty rules. This was psychological warfare dressed up as neighborhood order. Still, the neighbors didn't dare speak up publicly. Karen had a grip on them, not with force, but with fear. Fear of escalating fines, of public shaming, of becoming her next target. That's how she kept control, and that's what I had to dismantle. I went back to my files and began assembling a case. With every passing day, my quiet investigation grew stronger. I discovered that some of the HOA's expenditures had been misreported. Funds earmarked for community maintenance had suspiciously gone to a company owned by Karen's cousin. That same cousin was also the guy who delivered the new no trucks signs that had appeared just days before my fine. It wasn't just corruption. It was personal. But I couldn't act alone. I needed support from the city's housing board. So I filed a formal inquiry, not under my own name, but through a citizen tip line. I wanted to see how the board would respond without my title influencing anything. Within a few days, I received word that an auditor had been assigned to review the HOA structure and financial practices. The pieces were moving. Meanwhile, Karen sensed nothing. She was too busy cracking down on solar-powered garden lights that were too bright and issuing a new flyer about acceptable mailbox colors. She even cited someone for having excessively decorative address numbers. Her hunger for control was insatiable, and every new rule only made the neighbors angrier. But Karen didn't care. She believed she was invincible, and I wanted to keep it that way. The more confident she felt, the higher she climbed on her wobbly tower of authority. I wanted her to build it taller, stack it higher until the moment came when I could kick one block from the bottom and watch it all tumble down. I started showing up at HOA meetings, not to argue, just to observe. She gave me dirty looks, likely because my truck still sat proudly in the driveway, but she never said a word directly. Maybe she thought the silent treatment would intimidate me, or maybe she thought I wasn't worth the effort. Either way, she was wrong. At one of the meetings, I asked a simple question. "When's the next board election scheduled?" The room went quiet. Karen hesitated, then said there would be a notice in the next newsletter. It never came. That confirmed everything I needed to know. I began drafting a full audit request, attaching everything: altered bylaws, manipulated budgets, testimonial letters from residents, and a timeline of her power abuse. I submitted it through the city's internal channels this time, not as a resident, but as the mayor. I gave her enough rope to hang herself, and soon she'd do just that. But the game wasn't over yet. Karen had ruled unchecked for years, and people like her never go down without a fight. I could feel something brewing, like a storm right before the sky breaks. I didn't know what her next move would be, but I was ready for it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the man she fined for parking a truck was about to dismantle her empire from the inside out. And I was just getting started. You said it started with a simple envelope tucked into the HOA's mailbox. No return address, just a printed label that read formal complaint regarding misconduct and structural violations of OKD Community HOA. Karen didn't even notice it at first. It sat in the box for a day before one of the lesser board members brought it to her attention at the weekly HOA meeting. She opened it with a bored expression, half expecting some petty neighbor complaint about dog poop or Halloween decorations. But as she read through the pages, her face changed. Her smugness gave way to confusion, then concern. It was a detailed, well-sourced, and brutally direct list of infractions committed by the HOA board. More specifically, by Karen herself. And it didn't come from just one person. It came with anonymous testimonials from at least 10 residents, each one describing unjust fines, inconsistent rule enforcement, suspicious financial transactions, and blatant election manipulation. She sat in silence for a long time, flipping through the pages while the rest of the board looked around nervously. That was the moment the game began. Within a week, city officials quietly initiated an audit. It wasn't the kind of flashy investigation with badges and subpoenas. It was slow, deliberate, surgical. They started by reviewing the HOA's financial statements. They compared receipts with reported expenditures, contacted vendors, and followed paper trails that had long been forgotten. Meanwhile, I stayed silent. I still parked my truck in the driveway every night and waved at Karen when she passed by. Her waves had disappeared. Now she barely looked in my direction. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know from where. As the heat turned up, Karen reacted the only way she knew how, by tightening her grip. She doubled down on enforcement, issuing new restrictions almost daily. Decorative flags had to be removed unless they were seasonally appropriate. Trash bins now had to be hidden behind fences at all times. Garden borders could not exceed a certain height. Residents began receiving warnings and fines like confetti. But it wasn't strength she was showing. It was panic. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and demanded the attendance of all residents. It was the first time in years she'd opened a meeting to public comment. I attended, of course, sitting in the middle row, arms folded, watching the show. Karen stood at the front, trying to reassure everyone that the HOA was functioning just fine, that any rumors of wrongdoing were grossly exaggerated, and that these audits were routine. But she couldn't hide the strain in her voice. Her usual air of confidence had cracks. The neighbors, normally silent and submissive, started asking real questions. What happened to the landscaping funds from last spring? Why weren't there elections anymore? Why were some residents fined for rules others didn't even know existed? Karen deflected, danced around answers, and eventually blamed outside forces for stirring unrest. She looked right at me when she said that. I didn't flinch. I smiled. The more she squirmed, the more the room shifted. You could feel it. The collective realization that maybe they didn't have to be afraid anymore. Word spread fast. Stories began surfacing that hadn't been shared before, like how Karen had forced a family to remove their swing set because it disrupted the visual flow of the community park, or how she'd pressured a single mother to repaint her front door 3 times in 2 months, each time saying the color was too bold, too dull, or too inconsistent with the seasonal palette. Neighbors started talking to each other again, whispering in driveways, chatting in private Facebook groups, even gathering at the local coffee shop to trade horror stories. The energy shifted. People weren't just annoyed, they were angry. I knew it was time for the next move. Quietly, I organized a neighborhood meeting separate from the HOA, inviting everyone who had ever been fined, harassed, or manipulated by Karen's board. We met in the community center after hours, away from her ears. There were at least 30 people there. More than I expected. Some brought copies of their fines. Others brought photos of the infractions they'd been cited for. One man brought a folder of letters he'd written to the board, every one of them unanswered. I didn't tell them I was the mayor. I just listened, and then I asked the question that changed everything. What if we took the HOA back? There was silence at first, not from fear, but from disbelief. Could they really do that? Was it even possible? The answer was yes. The HOA charter, despite all of Karen's manipulations, still contained the original clause for emergency board re-elections if a certain percentage of residents petitioned for it. Karen had tried to bury it under vague language, but the clause remained. I showed them the paperwork. I explained the process, and when I asked who wanted to sign the petition, every hand in the room went up. Within 3 days, we had more than enough signatures, but even before we could submit the petition, the city auditors made their first public move. A letter was posted on the HOA bulletin board stating that the HOA's financial records were under formal review by the City Housing Authority due to allegations of mismanagement and unauthorized bylaw modifications. That was the crack in the dam. Karen held another emergency meeting, but this time no one came. The boardroom was nearly empty, and her usual air of control had vanished. She stood at the front with her papers, trying to save face, but her voice shook. She started lashing out in emails to residents, accusing unnamed individuals of plotting against the HOA, calling them troublemakers and liars. Her desperation was visible to everyone. Then came the final blow. A copy of the petition, along with notarized signatures, was officially submitted to the city clerk and the HOA Oversight Committee. The clause was triggered. A community-wide vote was required within 30 days to determine whether the board should be dissolved and re-elected. Karen couldn't delay it, couldn't manipulate it, and she definitely couldn't stop it. She tried. Oh, she tried. She sent out frantic newsletters warning that without her leadership, the community would fall into chaos. She went door-to-door campaigning, handing out flyers about saving the soul of OKD. But the neighbors had already made up their minds. They were done being ruled. They were ready to take back control. Karen had spent years building her little empire brick by brick, rule by rule, and now, in the span of a few weeks, it was all crumbling. Not because someone shouted her down, but because the people she'd pushed around finally stood up. And through it all, I stayed quiet, watching, waiting, because the real reveal was still coming, and she still had no idea who had orchestrated it all. The night of the town hall felt like something out of a courtroom drama. Word had spread fast about the upcoming vote, and every folding chair in the OKD Community Center was filled. Residents who hadn't shown up to an HOA meeting in years were now sitting side by side with neighbors they barely knew, united by a shared sense of purpose and quiet anticipation. Karen stood near the front, shoulders squared, her usual clipboard in hand. Her smile was tight, eyes darting around the room like a person trying to count threats. She still wore that floral blazer she always used for meetings, probably thinking it gave her some sense of authority. But tonight, it looked more like armor full of holes. The energy in the room was different. Normally, Karen controlled the meetings like a theater director. She called on who she wanted, ignored who she didn't, and always ended the meeting early if things weren't going her way. But this time, she didn't set the agenda. The City Housing Authority had sent 2 officials to moderate. One of them, a no-nonsense woman named Doris, had been on the audit team. She stood behind the podium and opened the meeting with a single sentence that shifted the mood even further. Tonight, we will determine whether the current HOA board remains in power or is dissolved for a full re-election, as outlined in your community charter. There was no room left for manipulation. Karen tried to speak up, tried to frame it all as a misunderstanding, a smear campaign, a political attack from unnamed forces. Her voice echoed a little too loudly into the microphone, and you could hear the nerves behind her practiced tone. She talked about order, consistency, and how her leadership had maintained the beauty of OKD. But nobody clapped. In fact, a few people in the back let out quiet scoffs. Then Doris called for public comment. That's when it happened. One by one, residents stood up and spoke. Tim, the guy who got fined for his hose coil, read his citation aloud and asked if anyone else thought $60 for a looped garden hose made sense. The crowd chuckled. Grace, who had been cited for leaving her garbage bins out for 12 minutes, shared how she received her warning the same day she was taking her sick cat to the vet. Another neighbor brought photos of their chalk-on-driveway art, showing what Karen had called unacceptable graffiti. The stories were endless, each one more absurd than the last. And each time, Karen grew more and more visibly uncomfortable. She tried to interject, to clarify, but Doris shut her down firmly. You'll have time to respond after public comment. Karen's face hardened, but she stayed silent. She had no choice. Then it was my turn. I stood up, took a slow breath, and walked to the podium. I looked around the room at my neighbors. Some gave small nods. Karen stared at me like I just stepped out of her nightmares. My name is Ryan, I began, and you all know me as the guy who parked his truck in the driveway and refused to move it. A few laughs rippled through the room. That one fine led me to start looking deeper into how things are run around here. And what I found was a system that hasn't just gone unchecked, but has been actively manipulated for years. I paused and pulled out a folder. Karen has failed to hold legal elections, has funneled HOA funds into projects that benefit her relatives, and has selectively enforced rules based on personal bias. I have copies of these records. The City Housing Authority has reviewed them, and I'm here tonight not just as a resident, but as someone who believes this community deserves transparency, fairness, and accountability. Karen rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath. Doris raised a hand to quiet the room. Then I added the final card. And there's something else I think you should all know. 2 months ago, I was elected as the mayor of this town. The silence was so thick it felt like time had frozen. Karen blinked rapidly, her mouth half open, unsure whether to laugh or scream. Murmurs erupted throughout the room as neighbors turned to each other in shock. Someone in the front whispered, "No way." Another said, "Hear the mayor." It was the first time I had publicly acknowledged my role, and the impact was immediate. I didn't want to use my title. I continued. I didn't want this to be about power. I wanted to live here like anyone else. But when someone abuses that position the way Karen has, it becomes everyone's responsibility to speak up, including mine. Karen finally exploded. She stood up and slammed her hand on the table. "This is outrageous. You're using your political office to launch a personal attack. This is harassment." But Doris was unmoved. "Karen, please sit down. You'll have a chance to respond." "I won't be silenced," she shouted. "This entire meeting is a setup. He's turning you all against me with lies and conspiracies." But nobody was siding with her. Even her former allies on the board had gone quiet, refusing to meet her eyes. One of them, a meek man named Harold, quietly slid his chair away from her like she was radioactive. Eventually, Karen sat back down, defeated but still fuming. Doris closed public comment and opened the floor for the vote. Each household was given a single ballot. The question was simple. Should the current HOA board be dissolved for re-election? Neighbors moved toward the ballot table with determination. People who hadn't spoken up in years were now eager to cast their vote. It didn't take long. Once all the votes were collected, Doris stood before the room and read the results. Out of 82 households, 79 voted yes. Only 3 voted to keep the current board, and no one doubted who those 3 were. The room erupted in applause, Some cheered, others hugged. You could feel the tension breaking like a dam, giving way to a flood of relief. Karen just sat there, silent, staring straight ahead like a ghost watching her own funeral. The process for re-election would begin within the month, and until then, the city would assign an interim HOA manager to handle community affairs. Karen's reign was officially over. As people began leaving the hall, many stopped to thank me. Some looked at me with a mix of admiration and surprise, still processing the idea that the quiet guy with the truck was actually their mayor. I didn't need the recognition. I just nodded and told them this was all of us. I just gave you the spark. You lit the fire. Karen slipped out quietly without another word. No speech, no fight. Just the click of her heels against the tile as she walked into the night, stripped of the power she had clung to for so long. But I knew the story wasn't quite finished, not yet. There was still the matter of what the auditors found in those records, and what that meant for Karen's future. The days after the vote felt like a fog lifting over the entire neighborhood. People who used to avoid eye contact at the mailbox now waved, smiled, and even stopped to chat. Front porches that had been quiet and closed off were now full of life. Someone set up a lemonade stand. Kids drew chalk castles on the sidewalks without fear of citations. It was like the entire community had taken a collective breath for the first time in years. The tension that had ruled OKD under Karen's watchful eye had finally cracked, and what poured out wasn't chaos or disorder. It was relief. The interim manager assigned by the city was a man named Alan. Calm, fair, and about as far from Karen's style of leadership as one could imagine. He held open forums in the park, encouraged feedback, and actually listened. Residents were encouraged to submit suggestions for new rules, or more importantly, the removal of outdated and ridiculous ones. The no trucks policy was the first to go. The absurd fine system was suspended. Everyone who had been fined for arbitrary reasons over the past year received notice that their fines were being reviewed, and in most cases canceled altogether. Refunds were even being processed for overpayments and bogus charges. I watched it all unfold quietly, letting the community take the reins. I hadn't revealed my position to anyone for praise or recognition, and I didn't want to become the next source of authority people feared. My goal had never been control. It was peace. I still parked my truck in the driveway, now without a single flyer or fine greeting me in the morning. I still walked my dog in the evening and talked to neighbors about normal things like kids' soccer games and weather. Life had returned to something simpler, something right. But Karen wasn't done yet. Word spread that she had left OKD within a week of the vote. Her house, once perfectly manicured and aggressively symmetrical, was now empty. The real estate sign went up fast, though the whispers said it would sit on the market a while. Not many people wanted to live in the former air of a neighborhood tyrant. Someone saw her at the DMV trying to change her address and overheard her snapping at the clerk about her new living situation. Apparently, she had moved into a trailer park on the edge of town, one without an HOA. The irony was delicious. The self-declared queen of community order now lived in a place where lawn gnomes wore sunglasses and garden flamingos were practically a requirement. A few weeks later, someone forwarded a screenshot from a local Facebook group. Karen had started posting in her new community's forum, offering to help organize a residents' council for local beautification and regulation. The comments underneath were brutal. One simply said, "No thanks, Karen." Another said, "We like our flamingos, lady. Stay in your lane." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Back in OKD, the new HOA elections were held this time fairly. Open nominations, posted schedules, transparent ballots. I didn't run, of course. I'd had enough leadership responsibility for one lifetime. But I helped a few neighbors with organizing their campaigns and attended the meet and greet events. It was the kind of participation that used to feel impossible. Now, people showed up in droves. They wanted to be part of shaping a community they could actually enjoy living in. The new board was a mix of young and old, long-time residents and newcomers. Real people with real lives, not power-hungry clipboard chasers. Their first order of business was rewriting the community charter to prevent any future leader from consolidating power the way Karen had. Term limits were introduced, as well as mandatory community votes on rule changes. Transparency became the cornerstone of their governance, and people respected it because they had fought for it together. A month after the elections, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my front yard. I didn't call it a celebration, but that's what it turned into. The grill sizzled with burgers and hot dogs. Kids played tag in the yard, and folding chairs formed little islands of conversation. Someone brought a speaker and played old rock tunes. The air smelled like grilled grass and freedom. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now toasted each other with soda cans and paper plates piled high with food. As the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the pavement, I looked around and saw something I hadn't seen in years. A community, not a collection of houses. People laughing, talking, making plans for future events, trading stories. Not just about the HOA mess, but about their lives, their kids, their vacations. They were connected again, and in the center of it all sat my truck, still parked in the driveway, polished and proud, like a quiet monument to the battle we fought. At one point, Tim stood beside me with a plate of ribs and a grin. He nodded at the truck. "Guess that's staying put for good now, huh?" I laughed and raised my soda. "Unless someone wants to start another war." He chuckled. "Not a chance. I think we're all just glad to have our lives back." Later that night, as the last of the guests filtered out and the lights on the porch glowed soft and warm, I sat with my wife on the steps. She leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed. "You really pulled it off," she said. "We pulled it off," I replied. "Took a village to fix a village." She smiled and looked at the truck. "Still think you should have run for HOA president?" I shook my head. "Nah, let someone else enjoy the headaches. I'm happy just being the guy with the truck and a decent parking spot." In the weeks that followed, life continued quiet, steady, and peaceful. No more threats taped to mailboxes. No more citations for decorative plants. No more fear. Just people living. Every now and then, I'd catch a neighbor glancing at my driveway, maybe remembering what we'd been through. They always smiled. Karen became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered with a smirk. Her era had ended, and no one missed it. In a world full of chaos, OKD had found something rare, a sense of normalcy earned through unity and resilience. And I had my truck, my home, and a neighborhood that finally felt like home again. Turns out all it took to fix everything was a clipboard, a corrupt queen, and one parked truck in the wrong driveway. Or as I like to think of it, the right one.